Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to podcast 3 of Life, Love, God. And we're still in chapter 2. And before we begin today, I'd like to just say a couple of things. First of all, welcome back, and thanks for following this podcast series. Um, I guess the second thing I want to say is I'm not reading this book to you. That's something for you to do. um, I'm only going to point out inspirational quotes or stories that are inspirational in an attempt to get you, the listener, to read and study these words for yourselves. After all, they had a major effect on me. When I came to Sunburst years ago, the first time I was there was for a Kriya initiation. And I read this book during the 4 days of that 4-day weekend, and it changed my life. And I'm still here today as a result of what I read in these books, in this book. And I think that you'll find the same thing if you read and reread this. I've read this book now probably 4 times, and every time I read it, I get new information. So on the last slide in this presentation today, you'll see the links for how to purchase a copy of the book for yourself. So we've been talking a lot about Brother Norm's father and his influence on Norman as a child. And Norm said earlier in this chapter that his father had cast his cloak upon me. And that's a reference to something that gurus do to their disciples, or prophets do to the next prophet. So this happened in the Old Testament when Elijah cast his cloak upon his disciple Elisha. Norm's father did the same with Norman. So in order to cast his cloak upon a disciple, Norm's father had to be an extremely spiritually advanced soul. And due to his blindness and the challenges, he lived in the spirit most of the time. His great spiritual skills and knowledge he was able to pass on to Norm. And Charles always encouraged Norm to use and preserve his own gifts, and helped him to develop particularly his imagination and intuition in the preparation for his life's work. So in the last part of this chapter, we're introduced to Norm's mother, and his mother, Eileen, was mentioned only a few times in this autobiography. And I believe this one sentence sums up Norm's experience with his mother when he was a young child. He said, "My mother was involved in political work that demanded her presence away from home much of the time." So to say his mother was active is probably a gross misrepresentation or understatement. To give you some historical context, Norm was born in 1929. In 1920, due to the women's suffrage movement, women had gained the vote and had become very politically active. Norm's mother was appointed by the governor of California as the vice chairman of the Joint Legislative Water Commission. Now, water commissions were just being set up because Los Angeles needed water, and even in the area where Norm's parents were growing up in Lompoc was suffering from the fact that the cities of Santa Barbara and Montecito were siphoning water out of the San Ynez River, which had helped farmers and the inhabitants of Lompoc for years. So there was a fight going on at the time about how water was to be distributed in California. So this was an important situation. She was also the president of the Santa Barbara County Federation of Women's Clubs, and the club that she represented eventually was known as the Alpha Club. And just give you an idea what some of these people did, and this was before they started this, even before there was a vote for women in this country. Just to give you an example, the Carnegie Foundation built the first library in Lompoc, and it was called the Carnegie Library. It's now the Historical Museum. But that library had no books, and it was the women's clubs who raised the money to put all the books in the library. So these were important things. They built the World War One Veterans Memorial in Lompoc. They did a number of things that were to build up the San Ynez Valley. She was president of the Lompoc PTA. So that probably, if I, having been members of the PTA with my own children, being president of the PTA for an entire area, that's a big responsibility. And in 1932, when Norm was just 3 years old, she ran unsuccessfully for the state assembly in California. So she was a busy woman. Now, these are some, in my research, these are some of the articles I pulled out of the archives of the Lompoc Record. And if you look across here, you see Norm's mother being mentioned in an article where she's attending executive water sessions in Sacramento. These are some of the reasons why she was away from home so much. The second one is about her going to the state PTA convention and then coming back and reporting to the local area. This is the third one is when she was elected to be a head of the women's organization for Lompoc. And then you see the final one is a little piece about Eileen Poulsen running for state assembly. So active woman, had probably had a very great influence on Norm's life for being active and being involved in what was going on in the world. So we also are introduced to Jane Chapman, who is referred to in this chapter only as Nana. Nana was Eileen's mother, and Norm has a sentence in this chapter that just says, "My grandmother Nana cared for me in her, my mother's absence." So when I've talked to people who knew the stories of Brother Norm and his parents and his grandmother, most people have said his grandmother pretty much raised Brother Norm. And there's an experience in this chapter, and I'm not going to read it to you because it's almost hilarious of the reaction if you're already on the spiritual path and you understand the concept of samadhi. Norm, when he was just a toddler, happened to be looking up at the sky and looking at the sun and then the moon, and he went into full-blown samadhi as a toddler. So a couple things we learned from that story. One is that Norm's grandmother, Nana, had no concept of what was happening to him. All she knew was she had to slap him back into consciousness. But the other thing this story tells us is Norm was extremely spiritually advanced when he incarnated on this planet. He was already experiencing samadhi as a child. The other thing that Nana did was she kept a record. She wrote the words down that Norm would say, because he had strange words and expressions, and she was kind of concerned about the fact that he made up nonsense things. For instance, when Norm first made his first trip to Santa Barbara with his family, and he said, Nana, look at the big lau," as he pointed to the ocean. And so, where did that word come from? Well, if Brother Norm had had many past incarnations, as all of us have had, strange words could be from a different language. In fact, Norm said himself that he was still in touch with his book of life and knew something about his previous incarnations, and these words came out of that consciousness. So in a book I was studying called The Account of the Polynesian Race by Abraham Fornander, Lau or Lau meant the ocean or the sea in ancient Polynesian dialects that are no longer being used. Very interesting. So he used the right words. It was Lau meant ocean, but it was in a language that he'd known incarnations ago. One day Norm asked Nana, "Nana, will you take me to a hootenanny?" And Nana said, "What are you talking about? Norman, what's a hootenanny?" And Norman explained it's a place where people sing and clap together. So, in studying this word, I wanted to look at the etymology of hootenanny, because we're all familiar with it today. There was even a television show called Hootenanny for years that had basically folk singers on it. But this was around 1930, probably to 1934 is my guess, that this experience happened. And in that time, the entomology experts in America say that the word had its origin in the Appalachian Mountains in the 1920s, and it had been introduced by Scottish immigrants. It was used as a placeholder word, or kind of like a nonsense word. So in the same way we would use the expression, it's a thingamajig, or it's a whatchamacallit. According to entomology experts, it wasn't until 1940 that the word was used to describe a gathering of folk musicians. So where did Norm get this word at the beginning of the 1930s? Well, in doing some more research, I found a book published in England that described the word hootenanny as a very old Scottish word meaning a party. So this obviously came from a previous incarnation where he was familiar with Scottish terms. The other experience happened probably in Santa Barbara, but it could have happened in Lompoc. He was driving or walking somewhere with his grandmother, and he said, "Nana, look at the sad Baba." And, they were looking at this disheveled man sitting on the sidewalk with a brown paper bag drinking out of it, probably an alcoholic. But once again, she wrote this word down because she had no concept of what it means. Most of us are familiar because of our connections with India that it's a common word still used in India to mean father. It's actually, we use a similar word in Greek to describe father also. So these were not nonsense words as Nana thought. These were words that came from his previous incarnations. Now, Norm wrote after this experience about seeing the sad Baba. He said, "A good Baba seemed to haunt my memory. I found myself looking for him constantly. He had long hair and big, strange, lustrous eyes that were familiar." Now, we'll learn later on that Norm would recognize these big, strange, lustrous eyes as a young man, and he would realize those were the eyes that he had seen in his dreams and his visions while he was growing up. But, this reminded me of the experience of Yogananda when he found his guru. He and his friend Habu were sent to a distant marketplace in Benares, and as they were walking down the streets, as Yogananda had constantly done through his life, he was looking for the guru he had seen in his dreams and in his visions. And as he looked down one of the alleys, he saw his guru standing there, motionless at the end of the lane, and for an instant, his eyes caught the gaze of this man. And then Yogananda kind of shook that off and continued to walk, thinking, "You're just dreaming, just walk on." And as he began to walk, his feet got heavier and heavier until he couldn't move them. And he realized that he was being magnetically drawn back to him. So he gave his packages and put them in the arms of his friend Habu and went back to that alleyway, looked down the alley, and he retraced his steps there. And when he saw that quiet figure still gazing, he said, "Gurudeva," and walked towards him. He said, "The divine face was the one I had seen in 1,000 visions. These halcyon eyes in a leonine head with pointed beard and flowing locks had oft peered through the gloom of my nocturnal reveries, holding a promise I had not fully understood." And then the guru spoke, "Oh, my own, you have come to me. My guru uttered the words again and again in Bengali, his voice tremulous with joy. How many years I've waited for you. It was those eyes of Swami Sri Yukteswar that Yogananda recognized, and just the same, Norm was seeing those big, strange, lustrous eyes of his guru that he would one day see in physical form. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today for this brief podcast, and for next month, please read Chapter 3, Jin Chow, I Meet a Real Prophet. Well, thank you very much. Until next month.